Okay. Where's Brendan gone? Brendan, are you there? That screen on there?
Yes,
Right.
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay. This is all about managing your CPD or managing your continuous development, professional development. And I've been reading an article now on pest control, which I got today. And there was an article in it on managing your CPD. And basically it talks about changing your attitude to CPD. So instead of using it as a points collecting system, try using some of the following 5 approaches to it. Let me just sort this screen.
What's got it going on here?
Trying my best to sort this screen out. Let's have a look. Right. So the first thing you need to do with managing your CPD, you've got to identify your own personal training needs. So you've got to look at what you've got, decide what's missing in your knowledge and your skills, and what your can't do this. I'm trying to get rid of this thing on my screen. No.
It's all right here.
Yeah, it won't let me do it. Right. So anyway, and find out what you do know and what you don't know. That's better. So identify your training needs. Once you know what your needs are, you've got to plan your CPD activities. So what you can do is one or more of the following. Obviously, on the job training, if you're going to a course, whether it's a formal course or an in-house meeting or whatever, then you can record that. Seminars and webinars like this one are another good way of doing this. Informal training and manage your own learning. Reading, researching, looking on the internet, finding stuff out. Writing technical articles that you to research and share with others. So, for example, this one tonight, I did at 6 o'clock, this presentation. So, and I'm now sharing it with you. So that's part of my CPD, even though I'm not employed anymore. And it's just what I want that to be shared with you. Formal and informal discussions with colleagues, with customers, with whoever. You can also use your appraisal as well as your own appraisal that you receive from your boss, but any appraisals you do with your team can be useful to you. It's always worth noting that any public speaking event that you go to, where you're a keynote speaker or part of a session, it's always useful to record that so that you can use that as part of your CPD. And if you can coach anyone, that's even better. So, managing your CPD, undertake all of the activities that you've listed and planned and look to improving any weaknesses that you may or may not have. This can be over the year, standalone, or it can be a progression of activities that helps you through this. 4, reflect on your learning. This is, Dave's got a form on this that he will present at the next meeting. But basically, write down everything that you have covered. So what you've learned and how your knowledge has increased. What additional skills that you have developed. So one of the things you might do on your reflection is saying, oh, I didn't know that about CPD. I can do this. And you write that down as part of your CPD. And you can actually double. I mean, this session lasts about an hour. So you can claim an hour for being on this CPD, and you get a certificate as well. But you also get another one for managing and writing down these additional skills that you've learned. So what you've learned and how your knowledge has increased, what additional skills you've developed, how you will put all of you've learned into practice, Also keep any documents, videos, or presentations and photographs. Diarise your learning so that you can review it at a later date. So it might be that you forgot that you went on something earlier in the year. If it's in your diary and you can go back, whether it's an electronic or a paper-based diary, you can go through and keep that all updated. Finally, you need to decide how you're going to implement your new skills and your new knowledge. You need to be able to put it into your practice in your workplace. You need to reflect on your learning and use this information to see if you are meeting your original goals. Add any notes to your diary and any evidence that you've collected during the year. For example, for those of you who saw the video or came on the last parasite video or webinar, how many of you used my free fact sheet on toxoplasmosis from last month's session to help you advise your home caterers? So I can see, Steve, you've done that. And anyone else done it? I can only see a few of you at once. If you use that information on those fact sheets to share, so there's 1, 2 of you. But that's the sort of thing that you can use. I mean, if it's appropriate, it might be that you don't have any home caterers. But in effect, toxoplasmosis is something where the complete life cycle of that parasite is only where you get the complete life cycle in a cat. So any home caterers who've got pets and cats, then you potentially got a problem unless you're really stringent with your food hygiene. And if anyone wants a copy of that PDF, I can send you it if you email.
It has, but oh well, that's life and technology in the 21st century. Anyway, so today we are going over the Campylobacter, mainly Campylobacter jejuni. And we're sort of going to briefly go over some of the main points, because when I first did this, I got up to about 40 slides, so that was probably a bit too long for this discussion. So I've tried to condense it down to more of like the bullet point facts, but at the same time, everybody here should at least be able to take something from it that they'll benefit from, whether it's through teaching, etc. So the main things which you want to know about Campylobacter jejuni is obviously it is a gram-negative bacteria, which is very important because that's part of why it's becoming a anti-resistance bacteria. Its mainly function as a curved spiral rod. It is microaerophilic, which essentially means it requires oxygen for growth but prefers those lower levels. Now, this is very important when you think about vacuum packing. So this is where we're looking at vacuum packs where there will still be a certain level of oxygen left available in it. So sort of think of that microaerophilic as those not necessarily completely exposed vacuum packs that have still got some air in. One of the things that I've really gone down to is this low infective dose of around 500 bacteria. Anybody that understands microbiology understands that 500 is next to nothing in terms of bacteria, etc. When we look at things like Salmonella and Staphy, which obviously require hundreds of thousands of bacteria to cause illness. Now, it has a toxin, which is an enterotoxin, and the toxin itself targets the intestine. So once it goes into the system, it waits in the system and then targets the actual intestinal system. Its temperature range, its minimum is 28 degrees Celsius, the optimum is 43 degrees Celsius, and the maximum is 45. On the pH scale, the minimum is 4.9, which relates to coffee and bananas. The optimum temperature is 6.5 to 7.5, so those neutral pH levels, that's things like milk, water. And then the maximum pH tolerance is 9.0, which relates to baking soda. Water activity, it's just a minimum of 0.97. If you were interested to know what that is, that's actually things like your normal mature cheddar, etc. So taking this low infected dose of around 500 bacteria, to understand the scale of this, there we are. This I have put as a 1 millimeter square, which is essentially going to be 1 million microns or 1,000 microns squared. Now we've got this little yellow circle here, or little square here. This is going to be a 10 micron square to give us a bit of a reference of how many bacteria can be in such a small space. So with this 10 micron square and your Campylobacter, In Campylobacter in length is 0.5 to a maximum of 5 microns in length, but it can be up to 8 microns in length. And its width can be 0.2 to 0.5 microns in width. So if you were to do a little bit of a calculation and sort of put that in as essentially maximum capability, you would probably be looking at about 40 Campylobacter bacterium per 10 microns squared. Now, when we actually look at Campylobacter under a microscope, if we're taking this scenario and we're saying this is our hypothesis for the maximum capabilities for Campylobacter, when you look under a microscope, they're not all clumped together. So you're essentially saying, well, that's if they're all living in close quarters, which is what they don't do. I mean, one of the distinguishing characteristics of a Campylobacter is obviously it has that flagellum, which enables it to move, and it enables it to move fast throughout whatever space it's going to. So looking at under that petri dish there, obviously you can see the Campylobacter is not all clumped together. So we'd say sort of a different set. If we just sort of say 20 Campylobacter per 10 microns squared, you'd be looking at about 2,000 Campylobacter in 1 millimeter square space, which is not a great deal. It's essentially, from one of the reports I was reading, as small as the smallest water drop full of Campylobacter will infect up to 10 people. So one of the things about the Campylobacter is it's very, very resistant to antibiotics. And if we look at this cell wall structure here, obviously we've got the los, the capsule, the outer membrane, the periplasm, the inner membrane, and the cytoplasm. It's the two membranes that actually create that function. It's one of the characteristics of a lot of gram-negative bacteria, because essentially the outer membrane, the inner membrane, it holds that violet color when you do the gram staining. So these two membranes, because it's got two of them, this creates this extra resistance to the antibiotics, which essentially makes the bacteria itself very, very difficult to treat, which will actually be really important when you start learning about all the different case studies and the type of severity that this bacteria can actually result into patients. So I've got this little video here. This is a fantastic video. If anybody wants it, just pop me a message. I'll pop this across to you. But this goes over Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is one of the more worst scenarios in terms of a Campylobacter gastroenteritis and the results from it. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
Jump straight in. Guillain-Barré syndrome is.
And obviously that is targeted towards medical students, but I think sort of the back end of that sort of shows how complicated the procedure can be if somebody does come down with the GBS syndrome. So just going to let me go. There we are.
Just not of interest, Brendan, does anyone know what prophylaxis is? Anyone got any idea what prophylaxis is? Well, if it's similar to the AIDS HIV virus, basically you give people the same drugs that you would treat the ailment with, which increases the risk of someone actually getting worse from it, because prophylaxis might make that symptom work. So prophylaxis on Campylobacter jejuni must be very similar to that. Sorry, Brendan, for interrupting.
No. It's a good contribution towards the subject, so it's definitely worth sort of noting and knowing about. One of the things that's actually gone missing off this now, which I definitely wanted to put in, which now is gone, but it's now believed that Campylobacter is now outperforming essentially all of the forms of gastroenteritis and all of the forms of food poisoning. So that's definitely worth noting down, that essentially it's now the Western world's leading cause of food poisoning, which is one of the reasons why I've done a lot of research into it. But the Guillain-Barré syndrome, the main points we want to sort of identify from this is the Campylobacter jejuni they're the most common cause of GBS. About 1 in every 1,000 cases of Campylobacter will result in GBS. Early symptoms are weakness and tingling, which is likely to start in the patient's legs. This can progress onto the person's arm and upper body until it takes over the whole body. In severe cases, GBS develops, causing the patient to become paralyzed. GBS is characterized as a neurological disorder as the body's immune system mistakenly attacks the peripheral nervous system, which is a network of nerves connected to the brain and spinal cord. So essentially this is the body's immune system attacking the nerves, and essentially this is what can start and cause the paralysis of different parts of the body, which then leads on to the next one, which is the worst cases can leave a patient paralyzed to the point of needed assisted breathing. So after recovery, patients are likely to suffer from weakness, which may take years for a person to recover from. The structure of the two membranes in the periplasm in the cell wall structure increase the bacteria's defense to antibiotics, making treatment essentially more complicated to treat. And there is no known cure to Guillain-Barré syndrome. Recovery can take weeks, months, or years. Treatment given to patients is to lessen the severity and to help with the recovery time. So in terms of risks and controls, cross-contamination will always be the biggest control. This is through, for instance, like hand washing and using of dual-use utensils, etc. So your controls is obviously going to be the thorough, strict hand washing and washing of all equipment, tables, utensils, and in the production and preparation of food. One of the main controls amongst anything is going to be training of junior staff and training of inexperienced people. One of the big ones, especially for me at the moment in time, is the lower cooking and sous vide cooking. Obviously, this bacteria, it has essentially the tolerance of up to 45 degrees Celsius. I have got a little recipe later on that actually identifies that some of the recipes that are circling around the chef's groups are quite concerning for bacteria such as this. So the controls: thorough cooking of food products, ensuring dishes are cooked, such as pate, especially doing this for a hazard analysis. So essentially looking at Campylobacter and essentially saying what is the hazard, how do we control it, and essentially as long as you are going above this 45, which is tolerable, then you are limiting the Campylobacter. Obviously it doesn't limit to that. Whenever you're doing a hazard analysis, look at all the bacteria. I don't want anybody looking at 45 degrees Celsius and saying 46 is safe then, because obviously there's plenty of other bacteria that are more tolerable to high temperatures. Next risk: excrement and fecal matter on eggs itself will contain the bacteria and can easily contaminate hands and food. The amount of people that I've seen handle raw eggs and the shell and not bother washing their hands afterwards is quite a serious matter. The controls: purchase eggs from reputable suppliers, wash hands when handling raw eggs, and again, training of all staff and any inexperienced people. So, Campylobacter and gastroenteritis causing diarrhea and vomiting, which will, all your cameras are in the way, which will hold bacteria and easily spread the disease. Obviously, this is a low dose organism, so very, very effective. Controls: ensure all members of staff, regardless of their department, are isolated from the working environment, even if they are suffering from sickness and diarrhea. This is essentially putting in the maximum controls possible. If somebody is working in the admin that's working in the same building as food handlers, how many people do we reckon that are working in administration know how to thoroughly wash their hands properly? So if they have sickness and diarrhea, going into the admin building, using the front door, touching that front door handle, and then indirectly contaminating everybody else that's going to touch that door handle. That's probably why it's vitally important anybody that is entering any establishment which have a food department are essentially isolated away from that building, so there's no possible form of indirect contamination. And finally, on the risks and controls, this is actually a recipe that I found on the internet, which is essentially an American recipe, which is why it's got 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's essentially, it's a sous vide recipe instructing a 43 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes, which obviously, if we think about Campylobacter, regardless of think about all the other bacteria, is really quite almost stupid to essentially say that this is a satisfactory level. But the risk is obviously untested recipes found on the internet. Now, this might be found on the internet or discussed amongst little chefs groups, etc. The main control is double check the sources of recipes and use food safety resource books as a guide to cooking safe food. Contact the UK Food Safety Form if you aren't sure about the safety of a recipe. There are plenty of bright people in the UK Food Safety Group that will be able to offer a good level of experience on that. And that just about ends that on the Campylobacter thing that I'd actually got all put together, minus a couple of slides which have gone missing, and I don't know whether that's giving up on me. Yeah, no, we're okay, we're okay. There we are. So how have we all found that? Does anybody have any more?
Yeah, it's a very, very good presentation, Brendan. Nice one.
Well, is there anything more anybody would like to go down onto Campylobacter
Brendan,
itself? Yes.
Steve, would you classify it as an infective and a toxic organism then?
It's when you're teaching food safety, you would normally treat it as infective rather than toxic. I know it produces an enterotoxin in the intestine, but it's more of an infective organism, such as brucellosis or hepatitis or things like that, right? Rather than if you get salmonella, that is infective. But get this right.
It's infected.
Rather than the one with what's the one with rice? I've forgotten. So that is definitely toxic, and it produces two types of toxin. It produces an endotoxin and an exotoxin, which affects whether or not you throw up or whether you have diarrhea. So that's, so you've got to keep it at the level. But this level we're doing on this video here, it's right for you to know that it's an enterotoxin. But I wouldn't bother with level 2 or level 3 even mentioning the enterotoxin, because it's just going to confuse people. The more you look, the worse it gets, the more confused you become.
So just to clarify on the toxin, is an endo or an exo? Does anybody know that one? Because
it's an enterotoxin. An endotoxin is what you'll find growing in your large intestine. An exotoxin is one where you'll get vomiting because you throw it up, your stomach gets rid of it. Whereas if it's an endotoxin, it's normally released on the production of spores or on the death of the cell.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas an exotoxin is excreted from the inside of the bacteria. Yeah.
Yep.
That's the difference. An enterotoxin, it's just a general gastroenteritis. It's not classified, to the best of my knowledge, as being one or the other. It's just something that makes you feel ill, gives you gastroenteritis. A couple of other points I've noted here, that the temperature range you've got, Brendan, for any that didn't know, is classed as a mesophile or mesophilic, which is the mid-range. So it's not psychotrophic and it's not thermophilic, it's mesophilic. So that's the 28 to 45 degrees, right, which is the middle range. Campylobacter itself doesn't grow in colonies. So if you cough on a normal petri dish, you'll see these little spots on the petri dish, and you get the colonies from what they put a bit of meat on it or whatever. Campylobacter, because of the spirochetes, and because it's got flagella, are free to move all over the surface. So you can't actually physically see an awful lot on a petri dish containing Campylobacter. You've got to do a swab and spread it out that way. Also, when you look in a path lab, you actually don't use blood agar or their derivatives, which are very species specific. It's the only one, as far as I'm aware, that you use charcoal petri dishes. And what they do is these are agar infused with charcoal, and then you put them into something called a Campy pack, which is a bit of a plastic bag, which reduces the oxygen level to microaerophilic levels. You're right in saying it's the largest cause of food poisoning in Europe or in the world even. It's mainly found on chicken. And over the last few years, people have been saying, well, don't wash your chickens. And even places like Marks and Spencer's, you buy a chicken, you don't wash it, you cook it in a bag, the roasting bag that you buy it in. And that's where, the minute you start washing your chicken, or handling it in the sink, you're just going to spread the Campylobacter all over the food surfaces and equipment, and that's going to increase the risk of infection. And the other point I noted on your eggshells, besides the washing of your hands and not having chicken excrement on the outside of the shell, the point I would make is this: eggshells are porous, right? And if you ever had an old egg, it's got a bigger air sac in the egg because of the porosity of the eggshell. And you can test that by putting an egg in water, and if it floats, it's an old egg. Or if you crack the egg into a frying pan, it spreads out. Whereas a fresh egg won't have a very large air sac, and it'll be quite tight in there. But eggshells are porous, so they will allow water and bacteria to penetrate the eggshell and contaminate the egg. And with it being a fairly low infective rate,